Japan is about to attack the United States of America. On board the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, the pilots are woken at 4 a.m. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida gathers them together for the traditional sake toast to the emperor. Fuchida will lead the attack on Pearl Harbor, the large American naval base in Hawaii, according to the bold plan devised by Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto wants to deal a decisive blow and eliminate this obstacle to Japan's conquest of the Pacific. Fuchida recounts, "We took off for Pearl Harbor. I shouted out the code words, Tora, Tora, Tora. The attack comes as a total surprise. Marine Corporal Earl Nightingale, who was on board the battleship Arizona, describes the scene. An explosion caused the ship to shake violently. I looked at the boat deck and everything seemed aflame. I reported to the Major that the ship was aflame. The Major ordered us to leave. I was the last man to leave. The bodies of the dead were thick and badly burned men were heading for the quarterdeck, only to fall, apparently dead or badly wounded. In this attack, launched without any declaration of war, 2,500 Americans died and 1,200 were wounded, whereas less than 100 Japanese pilots and sailors were killed. These images would shock the American people. They would no longer oppose their country's entry into the war. Yet the Japanese forces did not land in Hawaii, nor did they take Pearl Harbor. They sunk part of the American fleet, but only the now outdated battleships. Aircraft carriers would become the key to victory in naval warfare. And the 3 aircraft carriers based in Pearl Harbor were not there. They were all out at sea, and so miraculously, they remained intact. The President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had been expecting an attack. Tension between the two countries was at its height. But who would have imagined that Japanese naval aviation units would be able to strike 5,000 kilometers away from their bases? The next day, Roosevelt goes before Congress.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
It is indeed an invasion. On the same day, the Japanese attacked the British colony of Hong Kong. Then they bomb the American air bases in the Philippines and land on the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese have already established a strong foothold in China. They invade the British colonies of Burma and Malaya for their rubber, the Dutch colony of Sumatra for its oil, and they threaten India and Australia. A few months earlier, they had moved into the French colony of Indochina. After France's defeat in 1940, the Vichy regime, which was unable to refuse anything to an ally of Hitler's, had turned some of its air and naval bases over to the Japanese. The United States retaliated by cutting off its oil supplies to Japan and freezing Japanese assets. These economic sanctions had pushed Japan into the war. The country, a chain of overpopulated islands lacking in natural resources, was rapidly developing. It was in need of raw materials, and it set out to conquer the nations who had them by force. Japan had built up its navy to become one of the second most powerful fleets in the world, with no less than 10 aircraft carriers, and with highly sophisticated fighter aircraft. The remarkable Zero, for example, which outperformed Allied planes in terms of speed, maneuverability, and range. This in addition to an army of millions of men fiercely devoted to their emperor. Hirohito is the 124th Emperor of Japan. The scholarly monarch studies marine biology in a laboratory in his palace. He is a living god. The actions of his military are covered by his divine authority. In China, the imperial army had carried out unbelievable massacres, such as in Nanking in 1937, where 300,000 Chinese were slaughtered before the Japanese could proudly parade through the Forbidden City in Beijing. The emperor reigns, but does not govern. Power lies in the hands of General Tojo and an ultra-nationalist group that controls the country via their local Gestapo, the Kempeitai, and via loudspeakers that broadcast the official declaration of war against the United States. These Japanese pilots who took off from Indochina at breakfast time do not fear the British. They are looking for 2 British battleships that have come to protect Singapore, the venerable Repulse and one of the most modern combat ships of the time, the Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy. They are both sunk by the Japanese in less than an hour. A fateful date, the end of Great Britain's dominion over the seas. The following day, in Berlin, the Führer goes to the Reichstag for a meeting of Nazi leaders. For 4 critical days, since Pearl Harbor and Japan's entry into the war against the United States, Hitler has been waiting in vain for Roosevelt to declare war on Germany. If Hitler sides with Japan, perhaps Tokyo will support him in Russia. The German generals, however, are far from enthusiastic. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, has tried to dissuade Hitler, but Hitler declares war on the United States. We know what powers stand behind Roosevelt. It is the eternal Jew. I am grateful to the German people for designating me to lead this historic struggle that will determine the history of the world for the next 10 centuries to come. The British Prime Minister phones Washington. Roosevelt says we're all in the same boat now. This is the moment Churchill's been waiting for the last 2 years. Roosevelt had wanted to show his electorate that he'd done everything he could to keep the peace. The war has now become a world war, and Churchill now feels stronger.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
Churchill severely underestimates the enemy. Hong Kong falls to Japan in just 17 days.